Welcome to Washington State PTA's Standards of Affiliation. Washington State PTA provides a Standards of Affiliation, or SOA, agreement to reaffirm the conditions of PTA affiliation that were put in place when your PTA or council chartered originally, and to help local PTAs and councils track and navigate legal requirements. This document's an important tool. It's a tool for communication, a tool for management, and a tool for education. It's like a health check for PTAs. It helps everyone know when support is needed. Washington State PTA has a similar SOA agreement with National PTA. The SOA defines what a PTA in good standing is and makes clear what the criteria are for program participation, grants participation, and more. According to the Washington State PTA Uniform Bylaws, a local PTA or council in good standing is one that meets the criteria in the Standards of Affiliation Agreement. This creates a shared understanding about when support and guidance is needed for a PTA and results in improved service that's consistent across the state. Completing this checklist will help local PTA and council leaders ensure that their independent nonprofit business remains current with all IRS, state, insurance, and PTA requirements. We encourage you to include your entire board of directors in this work and keep your members up to date with your progress. There are many benefits to local PTAs and councils in good standing. They have the support of Washington State PTA staff and our region service delivery teams, and access to Washington State PTA resources that include training, website resources, leadership guides, and many more. Many other benefits of being in good standing are listed for you on this slide. What do you need to do to take care of all your Standards of Affiliation agreement requirements? These requirements can be tracked using the provided checklist. Put a copy of your checklist in your legal documents notebook. Keep other documentation that shows that you fulfilled the requirements as well. Suggestions for documentation are given in Washington State PTA Policy 3.1.5. You can find our policy on the website under Governance. Involve your entire board in this process. It's part of their due diligence. Make sure your entire board is aware of these requirements and that they're made aware when requirements are completed. We also recommend that you discuss with your membership and record in your membership minutes that the SOA checklist requirements were completed. Ask for help if you need it. That's what we're here for. This is what the SOA checklist looks like. We'll go through the various requirements on the next few slides. New this year, there's a separate SOA checklist for local PTAs and councils. Both versions will be included in the SOA document that's posted to the website. We've broken out the requirements into sections for the State of Washington, IRS, Insurance, and Washington State PTA. There's a column where you can assign the responsible PTA leaders and a column for you to track when each requirement is met. We're going to walk through the requirements of the SOA. There are a few changes for 2020 that we'll talk about as we go. There are 14 requirements for local PTAs and 14 requirements for councils. Many of these requirements come from the state of Washington, the IRS, and insurance, and they apply to all nonprofits, not just PTAs. The state of Washington has 3 requirements for local PTAs and councils. The first is that officers are elected. Washington state law requires president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary are elected at a membership meeting. It's recommended that new officers are elected before the end of the previous fiscal year. Washington's Secretary of State requires an annual corporate renewal. This needs to be filed by the end of the month in which your PTA was originally incorporated. That information can be found under your corporate information on Member Planet. If your PTA raises more than $50,000, you will also be required to file charitable solicitations with the Charities Division of the Secretary of State. This filing is due by May 31st. There is also a free optional filing available to PTAs who raise less than $50,000 a year. The IRS has two important requirements that you should be aware of. The first is the annual filing of the IRS Form 990. This is due no later than November 15th of each year. Form 8822B is a change in responsible party. Within 60 days of a change in the primary officer for the PTA, this form should be filled out and submitted to the IRS. Insurance requires that the PTA conduct a year-end financial review. It's recommended that that review is completed by August 31st in order for your PTA to be best prepared for the new fiscal year. Washington State PTA has several requirements that apply to both local PTAs and councils. We ask that you enter names and contact information for all elected officers and for key non-elected positions like membership, advocacy, reflections, and programs into the membership database and keep that information updated throughout the year. Each PTA and council needs to have a budget approved by the membership for the current fiscal year. It's recommended that this budget is passed before the end of the previous fiscal year. Each PTA and council needs to have standing rules that have been approved by the membership for the current fiscal year. It's recommended that these rules are approved at the first membership meeting of the current fiscal year. Nominating committee is new to the SOA for 2020, but it's not a new requirement. It has always been required by the Washington State PTA Uniform Bylaws. It was added to the SOA because it's such an important indicator of overall PTA health, and we wanted to raise awareness around this requirement and make it a topic for support. 3 members must be elected to a nominating committee at least 30 days prior to the election of officers. It's recommended that this election happen at the first membership meeting of the current fiscal year. Each PTA and council must have insurance. Appropriate insurance should be evaluated and purchased prior to November 30th to prevent a lapse in coverage. And finally, each PTA must meet the training requirement. You'll have more about the training requirement on the next slide. The annual training requirement in the SOA hasn't changed. Each year, at least one elected officer must attend PTA and the law, and all other elected officers must attend at least one Washington State PTA approved training before this year's Washington State PTA convention. The other requirements remain the same as well. Training received at or after convention counts toward the next fiscal year, and a person who attends an approved training and holds multiple offices shall have fulfilled the requirement for all of the positions they hold. Washington State PTA has a couple of requirements that apply to local PTAs only. The first is a 25-member minimum. This 25-member minimum comes from Washington State PTA Uniform Bylaws. PTAs need to have had at least 25 members or an approved membership waiver the prior fiscal year. For the current fiscal year, PTAs need to enroll at least 25 members no later than October 31st. This date was changed to align with the end of our membership year. PTAs need to have members to do business, so new members need to be in the database by October 31st. The second requirement is that membership dues are paid and current. Washington State PTA has 2 requirements that are for councils. First, councils are required to offer a reflections program for local PTAs. The second requirement is not a new requirement, but it is new to the SOA. This comes from the Washington State PTA Uniform Bylaws. Bylaws allow councils to charge a fee for service to the local PTAs they serve, and sets out that for that fee, PTAs will receive services, information, support, and leadership training. Washington State PTA is not telling you what that should look like, but is reminding councils and local PTAs that councils have committed to providing these things for local PTAs in return for council fees. a reminder, PTAs and councils may take their own position on any issue, provided that the position does not conflict with adopted Washington State PTA or national PTA positions, resolutions, or issues, or with the values, mission, vision, and purposes of PTA. The following SOA agreement requirements may be verified by the Washington State PTA staff or executive committee throughout the year. These haven't changed. These items are required for a local PTA to be eligible to receive grants or program funds from Washington State PTA or National PTA, to participate in Washington State PTA and National PTA awards and other programs, including the Reflections program at the national level, to send voting delegates to Washington State PTA's Convention and Legislative Assembly based on Washington State PTA uniform bylaws, and to bring issues and resolutions to Washington State PTA for consideration. The participation eligibility requirements are as follows. Officer names and contact information. At a minimum, Washington State PTA needs a president or primary point of contact. A 25-member minimum is met. The PTA had at least 25 members or an approved waiver the prior fiscal year and has enrolled at least 25 members for the current membership year no later than October 31st. Membership invoices are paid and current. Councils and service delivery teams may use the SOA as part of their service. We encourage this. We love to see the really creative ways councils and service delivery teams have created to involve their PTAs with the SOA and to educate their leaders. From having conversations about SOA requirements to holding contests to running fantastic education sessions, we've seen some really amazing stuff. Councils and service delivery teams are welcome to work with local PTAs and help them meet their SOA requirements, but they don't have the ability to request documentation or conduct a review unless the Executive Committee of Washington State PTA has approved it. Remember, this is a tool for education, awareness, and communication. Councils and service delivery teams, they're not the enforcing body for any of these requirements. Think of this as PTA health indicators. When there's one or two warning flags, it's fairly easy to step in and support the group to improve their long-term health. But when there are a lot of warning flags, the PTA is at risk and might need longer-term support. That's when service delivery teams and councils can reach out to the region director. They can help you decide if it's time to apply to the executive committee for a review and build a support team to help restore the PTA. We are here to help. Our priority is to have healthy PTAs. Washington State PTA recognizes its responsibility to preserve the reputation and trust in the PTA brand through support of its local PTAs and councils. With that in mind, there's a process for SOA review through Washington State PTA if it becomes clear that a PTA needs assistance. If Washington State PTA becomes aware through a region director and area vice president that a local PTA or council is not meeting the requirements of the SOA, the Washington State PTA Executive Committee may recommend an SOA review, and they may assign a support team to assist the local PTA or council to meet those requirements and return to good standing. If you need assistance with this checklist, help understanding any of the SOA agreement requirements, or find that a requirement was not completed the previous year, please contact your council or region director. Additional SOA resources are on the website under PTA Leaders/Governance. If you still have questions about the standards of affiliation, you can contact council leaders, your region director, check the SOA resources on the Washington State PTA website under Governance, look at the Washington State PTA Policy Manual, Section 3.1, Standards of Affiliation, or email support@wastatepta.org. Thanks so much for everything you do for kids.